First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone who's joined us. I don't know if you've just participated in our discussion, but that was actually not part of the program. First, let me take care of the formalities. The first one is who we're thinking. We're thinking, as you might be able to see behind me, Helle Panke. It's a foundation in Germany attached to the leftist party, Linke, and also the Rosa-Luxemburg-Foundation, which is also part of the Linke. And they're financing this, this series. It's been going on for a long time. It's entitled Economics Beyond the Swabian Hausfrau. In those days, we were trying to deal with austerity. In the meantime, times have, after 2.5 years have really moved on. But it was a live series of talks here in Berlin, where I am. Hilary's in France, David's in Liverpool. And due to Corona, we are now online. So we'd like to thank them for making this possible. We have Leah, who's doing the translation. We'd like to thank her immensely. It's very hard work. So as guests, we have Hilary Wainwright. And we only have an hour and a half, a bit less now. And just to tell you about Hilary Wainwright would take that hour and a half. So I'm just going to say, look in Wikipedia about her. But what I would like to say about Hilary is she's one of these people who you could call an institution. I know, at least in my life, she's accompanied my thoughts with her inputs in the course of time. She's, I don't know if other people have this impression, but there are certain thinkers who you follow. In the course of time, you think they're part of the family. You know what they're thinking. You keep looking in, and the part of become part of your thinking process. Hilary has been that, at least for me, and I think for a lot of other people. Then we also have David Whyte. David Whyte is a professor for socio-legal studies at Liverpool University. Actually, I stumbled upon David because he did a brilliant book about corruption, which the field I always worked in. And in Germany, there are no good books on corruption. And suddenly there it was. I didn't know there was this sort of thinking going on at universities, because you don't think about that here in Germany. But he's moved on as well. And he's moved on a couple of times in the meantime. And the inspiration for this evening is his newest book. It's called Ecocide. I hope you can see it. The corporation, kill the corporation. Whoops. Kill the corporation before it kills us. David, who's Manchester University Press. It's a brilliant read. We've reviewed it if you'd like to have a look on our website. My name is Matthew Rose. I am from Brave New Europe, a website, www.braveneweurope.com. What we do is we approach the current problems in Europe in a progressive but holistic manner. That means we don't just look at the economics, we don't just look at the politics. We have the whole, try to get in the whole picture, which is also an interesting process with our authors to say, listen, when we began, we kept saying, which is over 3 years ago, we said, you can't leave out climate change. Just any analysis you make, you have to include it, which no one really took serious. In the meantime, we've got to that. So let's move on to the what we're going to do this evening. I'd like to begin with a tweet that was on Twitter today by someone about David's book. He wrote, refreshing to read an analysis that doesn't advocate micro-consumerism, bamboo toothbrushes, and recyclable toilet paper as a solution to climate breakdown. Fantastic call to action in the final chapter. We are the opinion, we are much further. And why we're doing this program tonight is, although in economics we don't believe in trickle down, the idea that if the rich have lots of money, it will all trickle down and we'll all be better off. So let the capitalists do whatever they wish to do, because it's going to benefit us all. It's rubbish. We don't even have to consider it any further, but we do we certainly do believe in trickle down in ideas, because you always have these pioneers, these people that we call at the cutting edge, who develop ideas, and then we try to transport them, disseminate them. They do too. They write books, they write articles, and they take part in webinars, and it starts trickling down. And I remember being in a couple of events before COVID, where you went in and said, well, climate change means system change. Stopping climate change means system change, which means we have to do something very serious about capitalism. And as soon as the word capitalism fell, I think everyone, at least in Germany, they'd become very, very pale. And it was just not a topic, it wasn't on. In the meantime, and I think this has a lot to do with the COVID phenomena, people are rethinking, and we're noticing that it's not, we're talking about 10, 20%, 30% people in Europe aren't thinking this, but we have a lot of progressives, I think, have finally just said, enough is enough. We aren't getting out of this if we don't do something about capitalism. We aren't going to get rid of inequality, and we are certainly not going to stop climate change. And this is taking off. And this is exactly the discussion we'd like to support tonight. And as I said, David's book really does raise the question, can you stop climate change and still have corporate capitalism? Or is that not at all possible? And at that point, David, I'll give you the word.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And look, I want to say danke sehr to Helle Panke, danke sehr to the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, and especially vielen Dank for everything that you've done to kind of promote radical ideas around the economy in Brave New Europe, and obviously allow me to kind of showcase the arguments in the book. And it's great to see so many people. I don't know how you do it. I spend the whole day on Zoom, and then people come after they've finished working on, presumably a lot of people here are working from home, and then come and stare at a screen to this two-dimensional world that we now inhabit. So I'm very grateful for everyone to be here. We'll try and make it as three-dimensional as possible as an experience. I wasn't planning to say this, but I'm going to just say something about the tweet Matthew mentioned, because something I'm not usually this kind of meticulous about my social media use, but the tweet Matthew read out about the bamboo toothbrushes and the toilet rolls, I noticed it came up on my timeline, and I noticed it was a like by a company called JB Wipes. And JB Wipes make bamboo, they don't make bamboo toothbrushes, and but they do make bamboo toilet paper. So the irony was that this tweet that was saying that bamboo toothbrushes and toilet paper is not the answer was retweeted by, I think, one of the foremost manufacturers in bamboo toilet paper. It's a bizarre circularity. And okay, it's kind of funny. And obviously that was a bot. It was a corporate bot. And that obviously alerts us to how far integrated into our social and cultural lives that corporations are when even the bots don't really care about what they're tweeting, even though it's kind of counter to the purpose. But I think there are some circular connections that I want to kind of make as we go through the discussion. And the first is a kind of incredible story, circular story, that I kind of anchor every chapter in the book around. And I hope you just let me kind of indulge myself in telling the story very, very briefly, because the reason I wanted to start telling the story that I introduce in every chapter is because it relates to the first recorded corporation, right? And by that I mean historians found the first evidence of a joint stock corporation where wealth was combined into a singular entity for the purposes of reproducing wealth. It was a company called Stora Kopparberg, which operated a copper mine in Sweden. And I won't go into the details, but it was a deal between German entrepreneurs, merchants, and the local the local bishop who had the rights through the Swedish monarch to the mine. That was the kind of early to mid 13th century. Now the mine didn't close until the 1990s. I mean, it's incredible, and it's undoubtedly the most important site of copper production in European history. So that's the first company. And when I started to kind of investigating this company and trying to find out what people had written on all aspects of what this company did and does, you find there's quite a lot of scientific research on the soil quality and on the water quality around the town of Falun, where this mine is in Sweden. And actually the heavy metals that are in the soil mean that there are some parts of the soil scientists think will never recover. The lake is poisoned. So there's a kind of enduring, you know, that's part of the story of the book. What is the impact that corporations have on their immediate environment? But also what's incredible is that company still exists. It's still alive. And that tells you something about the way that corporations can have a separate identity that I mentioned, a corporate personhood, separate identity which outlasts its shareholders, outlasts the real people who are involved in the corporation, whether that's the owners, the shareholders, the directors, or the workers. So the corporation is immortal, and it's now, through the generations, shares have been passed on and bought and sold and so on. But the same company now is a company called Stora Enso, which is one of the largest wood pulp production companies in the world. And I'm not going to get into the full intricacies of the story, but there's a couple of really interesting observations. It's now based in Helsinki. It's now headquartered in Finland. But it's been involved in a deal fairly recently, in the last 2 decades or so, which has made it the second largest landowner in Uruguay. And in Uruguay, it plants eucalyptus trees. And it's been in conflict with the landless peasants movement in Brazil. It's been in contact with, in conflict with local people, quite violent conflict at some point, because of over the ownership of land in both Uruguay and Brazil. And it's also been accused of planting monocultural varieties which destroy the biodiversity of the parts of the forest. Now, this is not a company. I mean, it sounds like I'm going really full on into attacking this kind of company. Actually, it's never, you know, Stora Enso would never be a company that would be in the firing line of, you know, it wouldn't be the biggest demon in the firing line of environmentalists. And obviously, environmental organizations have criticized it, and in fact, Swedish environmental organizations criticize it for its lack of reduction of biodiversity, actually in the same, where it's planting trees in the same county, Dalarna, where Falun is, where the mine is. So there's this incredible circularity where the world's first company lives forever, effectively, or is still alive, and has, in various guises, been destroying its environment. Now, there are two things I want to say about that. One is that those who profited from the company, from the investment in the first place, will never ever have to pay for the environmental damage, the environmental clear-up. Even if they did have to, some of that damage is irreparable. It can't be repaired. So that brings us to a second principle that's embedded in the corporation. It's not just not only does it live forever, not only is it kind of invincible in that sense, but also it's the real people that stand behind the corporation are never even questioned about the fallout of what happens. Sometimes directors might be questioned, but very rarely are investors, the people who benefit from those kind of activities, even in what seem to be the most kind of mundane context. And I think Stora Enso is relatively mundane. It styles itself as, and its slogan is creating value in the bioeconomy. And you know, to some extent, you can see why it has that claim, because it does plant trees in the Amazon and in other parts of South America where deforestation has been a problem. It does produce something which is also renewable, right? But at the same time, there are major questions about the environmental damage does. And I think we have to say that there's also a very intimate umbilical link between the structure of the company, which gives it impunity, and the fact that it's able to live forever, effectively reproducing those same kind of damages. Now, I also foreground that company because I don't think we should just be talking about big oil, big chemicals, and big pharma, because at some point we have to recognize that our entire economy and the way our economy is based is to some extent controlled by corporations with anonymous investors that are set up in this what has been called by other academics, and I get into in the book, as a structure of irresponsibility, a structure which permits irresponsibility. And a big part of the book talks about the origins, the colonial origins of the corporation. And I have to say, I have never read in national newspapers the names of some of the most notorious Britain's most notorious colonial companies until Black Lives Matter and the movement that was of course a worldwide movement put some of those names into the front pages. I mean, maybe listeners here won't know what the Daily Mail is, but the Daily Mail is a very right-wing newspaper conforming to precisely what Matthew was kind of describing earlier, if you heard in his critique of the media. Pretty much it's sensationalist. It doesn't report much based on fact. But when it had to report the British Black Lives Matter movement, it had to report the toppling of statues on one hand and the campaigns against statues on the other hand. And there were two very important figures that were targeted. One was a guy called Edward Colston, and his statue was pulled down in Bristol. Now, the Daily Mail was reporting that Colston was the one of the leaders of the Royal Africa Company. I'd never seen that. I'd never seen that kind of reported or discussed in public, really. Now, the Royal Africa Company is absolutely crucial. It shipped more slaves than any other institution in British history, and maybe possibly even European history. When there was a campaign against another figure who was a bit later on in the history, Cecil Rhodes, the discussion was about his company, the British South African Company. And I think we don't talk about that history enough. And it's not just a history that is in the UK, in Britain. Every European country had its colonial corporations to kind of spearhead or to drive a real wedge into their colonial projects, to take a leading role in their colonial projects. And that's for a very specific reason. Corporations, they're very, very similar, almost identical to the model of the shareholder corporation that we have today, really began to become used prominently on a large scale in the colonial period. And there are two or three reasons. I mean, we could talk about this history. It's a fascinating history that I think has important roots also in Britain's colonisation of Ireland. But one of the things the colonial project needed was it needed to capture huge amounts of private wealth in order to successfully generate the power that was needed to reach those, to reach the colonies. The states couldn't do it on their own. So they had to create a structure through which people could reproduce their own investment, reproduce their capital, and the corporation was the perfect vehicle. So I think that's really important. If you look at, and Karl Marx never really developed this, but subsequently Marxist scholars have developed the idea in Grundrisse of the annihilation of space. Sorry, I've just forgotten the phrase. The annihilation of it's not space with time. Geographers call it time-space compression. And the idea is basically that because capital has to reproduce itself, it has to overcome limits of time and space. So it has to overcome geographical limits. It has to overcome the limits the annihilation of space by time was the Marx phrase. I knew I would get it at some point. And geographers like David Harvey have subsequently talked about time-space compression. And that's a feature of the investment of capital, because when capital reproduces itself, it has to try and pierce through all kinds of barriers, geographical barriers, regulatory barriers, and what I argue in the book are also human barriers. So the human barriers to the colonial project. And I think as part of that process, that drive to expand, the part that Marx doesn't really get into, but other scholars like John Bellamy Foster have developed in their work, the annihilation of space by time also means the annihilation of nature, by definition. So that the annihilation of nature, and indeed the annihilation of humanity, was really the business of those early colonial companies. It was to seize resources, to seize natural resources, and also to exploit human labor in the most horrendous ways. So that's a key kind of starting point, I think, that the book gets into. That annihilation of space by time is also the annihilation of nature, and we see that now everywhere. We see that in the global economy now. I mean, we could pick out. I mean, I think everyone in this meeting would know examples of that. So, for example, the UK's 75% of the UK's water footprint is abroad. It's not in the UK at all, and that's because of British companies operating abroad. And we know that from work by another colleague of Matthew's in Brave New Europe, that 75% or anything between 2,000 and 75% of resource wealth in Africa is extracted from Africa. Most of it ending up being siphoned through tax havens. And we know what the environmental legacy of those mines, of oil operations, whether it's in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, you know, or whatever. One analyst by Greg Moutet, who I've worked with in the past, I remember at the time of the Deepwater Horizon spill in Mexico, said, well, there's a Deepwater Horizon in Nigeria every week in terms of the amount of oil spilled. So that legacy continues. We know that, and we don't need to necessarily go through all the examples of that. I want to kind of ground this just for the next couple of minutes in our experience of COVID, because I think this is absolutely crucial. And in terms of understanding the conditions through which pathogens like COVID emerge, I think we can see precisely the same dynamic that I've just kind of summarized. So, and I'll talk about three different aspects. The first aspect is the kind of pushing back the frontiers of nature. And so one of the things about sylvatic pathogens, the pathogens that originate in wild animals. Now, we don't really know where COVID-19 came from, but we know that a lot of the most dangerous pathogens do come from wild animals. Probably that was the origin of COVID-19. When you push back the boundaries of that, the frontier, particularly through deforestation, what you do is you disturb species where those pathogens, those sylvatic pathogens would have died out naturally, right? And you open those up. And especially when you do it in an uncontrolled way, then you open up the possibility of all kinds of new diseases emerging and through relatively unregulated development. I'm not arguing against development. We could have that argument another time, but I'm arguing against the kind of unregulated development that we find in deforestation. And the big drivers are the big corporations. We know that. The financiers of deforestation in the Amazon, BlackRock, JP Morgan Chase, BNP, HSBC, the British Bank now headquartered in Hong Kong, Santander. The big drivers in terms of what's being produced in those areas are the big meat and soya producers like Cargill, JBS Beef, Mafrig Beef, and so on. And then they end up in the huge supermarkets, the Walmarts and the Tesco's and so on. So that risk, that initial risk where those kind of pathogens come from, is created through a corporate economy in which the conditions are relatively uncontrolled. And the second point that I think we need to recognize is that it's no coincidence that two of our last big viral panics were bird flu and swine flu. These were the pathogens that did originate in factory meat production. And what happens when you expand into a kind of corporate model of factory meat production? You expand the capacity for those pathogens to go to mutate through animals and then to humans. And that's just a kind of mathematical thing. If you have a huge large-scale pig factory, then it means that there's all kinds of pathogens that have a better chance of being transmitted. So again, uncontrolled corporate model is driving the scale of industrial meat production to a point that we wouldn't really have anticipated. The Smithfields, the American company that's now huge in China, the companies like Dukes and Tyson in poultry are really driving this model of huge scale meat production that's creating, let's not say their risks originate there, but the chances of new pathogens emerging are immeasurably increased by that model. And I said I would only spend a couple of minutes on this very, very briefly. Where the outbreaks have been in the UK recently, they've been in not just in food production, they've been in factories and in the big workplaces again, where I think we could point very clearly to how workers are not particularly well organised in the places there have been outbreaks. They don't necessarily are not capable of organising themselves to make sure their conditions are safe. But also, we've had 4 major outbreaks in poultry factories. We've had a number of other major outbreaks in food production in the UK. And that's partly because those conditions are also unregulated and are being scaled up, and workers are relatively powerless, they're ununionized, and of course the climatic conditions are probably quite beneficial for this particular pathogen. Or it seems that COVID-19 does like the cold. So look, I could go on and on actually, and I could talk about the circuits of capital which drive this. Goldman Sachs, which is now investing hugely in pharmaceuticals and the search for the vaccine, was actually one of the big investors in Smithfield Pork that I mentioned earlier. So the big financiers are creating these circuits of capital that we can't really get out of. And I would argue this is not conspiracy theory. This is not saying corporations created COVID. The corporate model of capitalism creates the perfect conditions through which we cannot control those pathogens. Okay, both through which they emerge, and secondly, through which we can't control them. And that's precisely the story that I tell in the book in relation to the environmental threats that face us. And I think it's important to kind of recognise that we're not really just talking about big oil. I'll finish on an example of big oil in a minute. But all of the threats that we face, all of them, right now, in terms of the complex threats to biodiversity, to climate change, and to other aspects of the ecosystem, all of those threats are produced largely by private profit-making corporations, that may well outlive us, right? Because they do have they are in a sense set up, as I've argued before, to be immortal. And one of the points I make in the book is that Stora Enso may well be in the Uruguayan forest long after any local people who've lived there for millennia. And that looks very likely to happen soon, right? So the threats that are facing us, the chemical threats, the threats in terms of plastics, the threats in terms of the productions of carbon, but also all the technologies that they rely on, whether that's transportation technologies, our energy industry, and this is documented very kind of in more detail in the book. All of those sectors are controlled by the same model of the corporation that we found in Stora Kopparberg, and then latterly as it modified slightly through the colonial period. And unless we do something about that, then I don't think we can take seriously that idea that the problem is system change. So the system change, not climate change, point has to be materialized. We have to look at where the power lies. And that's only because capital flows through, most capital in the world, most of the world's wealth flows through corporations that are threatening our very existence. And that's not to reify them, because part of the conversation we'll come on to is to think about, well, what do we do about that? Because I don't think, I've never, you know, in my work argued that there is a distinction between the state, for example, and the corporation. That's very clear to see. These are institutions which kind of sustain a capital system. I want to end on this point. On this kind of empirical example that emerged in the newspapers last week. The American oil industry has been lobbying fiercely to have plastics introduced, the export of plastics introduced into a trade deal that the US is doing with Kenya right now. And this is crucial because Kenya, some of you may have come across this before, but 2 years ago, Kenya imposed probably the most draconian anti-plastics regulatory regime in the world. And one of the reasons it did that, it banned plastic bags. And the penalty, I mean, I'm not advocating, I don't actually think that criminal justice systems are a solution to our problems. But what's interesting in Kenya is the fines for even possession of a plastic bag are huge. They're much more than for possession of most illegal substances. Now, what the American big oil companies have done is inserted clauses into the current draft of the trade deal with Kenya, which will smash that regulatory system. And the system was there for a good reason. Waterways in Kenya were being clogged up. People were not getting access to basic standards of water. And so what's happening is big oil is seeing the reduction in the oil price, the fact that they're going to have to diversify, they're going to have to move away from the production of oil and gas. And where do they end up? They end up in Kenya clogging up the waterways again. So that's just an example of how pernicious the model can be, and how it's not just about, I think, tinkering around with the regulation of one product or the other. We need to break the model, because the model will reproduce all kinds of threats as we get deeper and deeper into this crisis. And so that's where I end the book. I end the book by saying, look, it's not unreasonable to suppose that when we see something that's killing us, we defend ourselves. And that means we have to kill the corporation before it kills us.
Thank you very much, David. Before you take over, Hilary, I forgot to mention one thing for our viewers, listeners. If you want to raise questions, which we'll then go through at the end, there's a chat button underneath on the bar. Just go click that and put in your question, because we won't be able to hear you or see you later. So that's a way to ask questions or make comments, whatever. I'm going to say this briefly in German, because we have a lot of German viewers. Wenn Sie Fragen haben oder Bemerkungen, Sie können die einfach über einen Knopf da unten in der untersten Reihe, heißt Chat. Wie heißt es auf Deutsch? Chat auch, okay. Da können Sie einfach reintippen und am Schluss werden wir dann die ganze abarbeiten. Also das wollte ich nur darauf hinweisen. Und das mitgebe ich. With that, Hilary, you have the word.
Okay.
There you are.
Well, I'm really pleased to be part of this discussion. So thank you, Brave New Europe. And I think Dave has outlined so much that requires us to be brave. And I think his book is brave. And I think I really want to recommend not only you buy it, but you buy it for a friend, even buy it for many friends. Because what's amazing about it is that it brings together the threat of pandemic and the threat of climate change in a way which makes you want to act and to think strategically. And so that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to have just 10 minutes just to stimulate discussion. So firstly, I think it's really, I just want to, in a way, emphasize the importance of Dave's emphasis on the corporation, because sometimes the discussion about what is to be done sort of talks as if capitalism is unchanging and that it's a question of the government acting to control capitalism. But I think the point about the corporation is it's a product of capitalism. I mean, capitalism, you know, it always has this tendency, because it's driven by the need to accumulate profit and be competitive. It's accumulating, each company is accumulating profit at the expense of other companies. And so out of that comes this tendency, this drive towards, in a way, strangely, it's paradoxically, almost self-destruction. So corporations come out of companies competing to such a point where they actually want to see the destruction of a competitor, and they take over a competitor. And so the corporation grows. And this has happened essentially over, well, I remember, well, not remember because I wasn't alive then, but I remember reading about Nye Bevan in I think the late 40s. And he was saying that, okay, state intervention in industry is good, but when the state intervenes in business, business makes the state part of its business. So there's a sense in which every corporation, you know, has a strategy and a kind of relationship with government, which increasingly the balance of power is such that the corporation has way more power than government. So it's not enough to kind of call upon government to do X, Y, Z. I mean, the question that Dave's book, which is a call to action, as this tweet implied, raises is, what is the agency? What are the ways in which we're going to challenge the corporation? And I want to, having said that government isn't enough, now think about, well, what are the other agents of change vis-a-vis the corporation? What can change the balance of power sufficiently to actually be able to destroy the corporation? And I want to point to an experience which has always inspired me, which is a trade union experience. I mean, I'm not saying the trade unions are like the answer in some romantic kind of way, but there are experiences of where trade unionists, who after all are workers with concrete capacities and aspirations and lives and families and neighborhoods, where a group of trade unionists faced with a company, it was Lucas Aerospace, declared them redundant because it wasn't actually to do with lack of markets, it was to do with the way the company was restructuring, taking over some factories, closing down others, and it declared a whole group of workers redundant. And those included workers who were highly skilled, some of the best designers in the world. For example, Mike Cooley, who sadly just died, but he was like one of the world's experts in design, in engineering design. And anyway, workers like that who had a real sense of their capacity, a real self-confidence. And it was a collective self-confidence, which they'd developed over the years as part of trade unions that brought together these skilled design workers. Then it was AUW, the engineering workers, TAS, technical and associated scientific and supervisory workers. Then it was ASTMS, and now it's Unite. Anyway, I'm going to argue later, this is a really key group of people on whom the companies depend, because part of their competitive strategy is to do with innovation. And who's responsible for the innovation? It's not the managers or the shareholders, it's the designers and the engineers. Anyway, this group of designers and engineers, they refused to accept that they were redundant. And they said, well, actually, society needs our skills. And they looked around and saw the problems. Then it was the late 70s, so climate change wasn't an issue, but the environment and preserving, a sort of an environmental approach to energy conservation was. So they produced products that were to do with energy conservation, products which were to do with transport, more ecological transport. One of them was a product called a road rail vehicle, more medical equipment. Anyway, it was a sort of exemplary, I don't want to go into detail, you can find the detail, you can, I mean, if you just Google Lucas Aerospace Workers' Alternative Plan, you'll see different references. But they produced this they called it a plan for socially useful production. And it was an inspiration, which in a way lives on now. I mean, there's a group called the New Lucas Plan, and I'm often just bumping into young people who say, there was this initiative in the 70s, a group of workers who produced an environmental alternative. And then I say, oh, do you mean Lucas Aerospace? Yes, and somehow it's become this sort of symbol of the fact that there is an alternative, and the workers on whom the existing system depends are going to be key in developing that alternative. I mean, Dave mentions it in his book, but during the height of the lockdown, the kind of beginnings of the COVID pandemic, when the government was beginning to realize slowly, far too slowly, that it was important, there was this declaration by Johnson in the face of the ventilator emergency, which was a result really of the privatization of the NHS and the cuts in the NHS. But he declared with all that bombastic sort of self-confidence, you know, our corporations, you know, our British corporations are going to produce ventilators, you know, instead of airplanes or whatever. So I thought, this is a bit suspicious, because actually, who does the production? It's the workers. So I talked to the union official, and then I said, where are these ventilators being produced? And what's the role of the workers? So he gave me the contacts of workers in Airbus in North Wales. So this was during the lockdown, so I couldn't go and see them, which is normally what I like to do. So I rang them up. And sure enough, it was clear that the fact that all these ventilator, it was part of the ventilator production. It was not the only part, but all these, basically the kind of body of the ventilator was being produced in thousands from the conversion of the production of aeroplanes to the production of ventilators. Now that required an incredibly complex process, including the creation of a sterile environment and the organization of a skilled workforce. And so at the union, I talked to the union convener, and he said, well, it was possible because there was already a union organization which involved almost all the workers there, that had a procedure, had health and safety representatives, and the whole thing could just swing into action to organize that conversion. So it wasn't so much these great companies, it was actually the workers on the ground, organized with all their knowledge and all their capacity and all their collective cohesion and mutual trust to make this possible. And so I think now one's got to think, well, what's the relevance of this now? I mean, in a way, the ventilator experience shows its relevance, but the Lucas Plan depended on a very strong trade union movement that had immense bargaining power built up over the period of the boom and strong trade union rights. Obviously, we know that Thatcher, followed by Tony Blair, destroyed all that, so that actually the trade union movement is quite weak. But I think that what we're seeing now is this, and I can, you know, give you anecdotes. I talked to some conveners at Rolls-Royce, and they'd been involved in the ventilator production, and it was a memory that made them feel there was an alternative. They could do different things, and they were interested in hearing about the Lucas Aerospace Plan and that model of alternative production because of the movement around climate change. So in a sense, okay, they didn't have power, but they had huge motivation because climate change has become so obviously an imperative, and the movement of young people has been a real pressure that's led older people like these trade unionists to realize they've got to do something. And these skilled workers, these designers, have enough power and enough self-confidence to feel they can actually lead this process. And so the meeting was a very interesting combination, which shows what's possible, of these very aware trade unionists, strategically intelligent trade unionists, with a Green New Deal, a local Green New Deal in Coventry, which is where these Rolls-Royce companies are, or near Coventry, and a local MP, Zara Sultana, who's very sympathetic to workers' initiatives and used to support Jeremy Corbyn and his ideas, which also included that support for workers' initiatives. Anyway, so it showed that there's a kind of agent of change in the making, a strong green movement, well informed, drawing from university research like Dave's and other people, and often connected to the trade union movement, in this case the Trades Council. But they face a situation where the key trade unionists are strategically open to this kind of influence. And then you have a little bit of the Labour Party. I'm not a great fan of the Labour Party as a whole, but there are parts of the Labour Party that are really open and creative. And they can play a key role in helping to bring people together. So that gives me inspiration. So I think if we can all share ideas about how we can use existing resisting resources for change, to create a really powerful force against the corporation, I think that would be a way forward. Anyway, huge thanks to Dave and huge thanks to Brave New Europe.
David, would you like to reply at all?
I mean, it would be good to have a discussion, but I might say just a couple of things from a kind of a perspective of that Hilary's, articulated how we come out of this crisis. Because I mean, I agree. I can't see any way that we can survive future shocks and come out of this crisis creating the jobs that we need to in any European state, unless we have a Green New Deal, unless we have a way of creating an industrial strategy which creates jobs which will be sustainable, which we will need for a long time to come. And that's one of the tragedies, in a sense. And I'm thinking very, very personally from my trade union in my situation. And I actually am very supportive of my trade union. I'm very active in the trade union, but I think my leadership made a bit of a strategic mistake in that one of the things they did was call immediately for a bailout, a kind of no ties bailout, and spent a lot of their time just lobbying for more money, which would keep the system going as it is, right? Now, of course, one of the problems we're facing right now, and one of the struggles we're in, is to resist going back into unsafe workplaces because of the neoliberal model, which relies on not just student fees, but the hall revenue. The universities had to cram the halls full of students. So we have this neoliberal model, and unfortunately our response has been, we need to have funding which sustains the neoliberal model. And I'm also thinking about, look, the American Flight Attendants Union was very successful in getting a bailout from the Trump administration. No mean feat, if you're a trade union, to get yourself heard, but I think there's a very different institutional politics at play. But they were successful in getting subsidies which kept the American airline industry afloat and kept jobs. But the question will be at what cost, right? Because that's an industry that has to change its model. So I think one of the key things for us right now is not just survival, and that's the problem. COVID has placed us in this kind of situation where workers have to be defensive and argue for the survival of their jobs, and that very often kind of stifles the imagination in the same way that Hilary was talking about. That has to be our role, I think, as whether we're organisers, whether we're writing about this stuff, or whether we're in workplaces, we have to be constantly arguing for ways out of this system which change the system. Sorry, ways out of this crisis which change the system. So I think the examples that Hilary's pointing to are really, really important. She was a bit modest about the Lucas Aerospace example. The Lucas Aerospace workers in the late 70s, early 80s came up with the prototype for wind turbines, which is now being used today, and Hilary's documented that actually, and came up with a heat pump system that is now widely used as the most efficient system in homes, decades before it was rolled out. So I think it's not just imperative that we do it, but actually the point about the capacity that we have at the moment can only be released if we have a different model is irrefutable, actually, in terms of the points that Hilary was making.
Let me go over to the questions. First one is, can you be an environmentalist and fly? This question is not at all intended to undermine the importance of system change as opposed to individual change. The vast majority of us could easily never fly again. As environmentalists, should we be content to continue supporting the industries we know are destroying the planet? And should we continue enjoying the unsustainable luxuries that will no longer be around if we achieve our goal of preventing climate breakdown?
That's a difficult question that I think Hilary's going to let me answer first. Is that right, Hilary?
Never mind. I feel I can contribute.
Go on. Do you want to?
Well, just a quick one, only because I'm in France and I live in Britain, and I came by train. And I honestly think that if we sort of give ourselves a mental veto on flying, so that we think about other solutions and then think, what would be the conditions for this solution to be available to everybody? So, you know, clearly travel in Europe can be done by train. Now, the train system is not brilliant in Europe. It's certainly, the one on mainland Europe is more cheaper for the user than in the UK. But the systems are not brilliant, you know, like to get from London to Florence, you know, it's quite a long and arduous journey. I mean, with quite a few changes, but it could be organized. You could have a really good, if there was the investment in trains, in rail transport rather than air transport. And if it was rail transport related to human need rather than things like the HSB, which is really just to allow kind of businessmen to have 10 minutes more at their meetings. I mean, you know, you could have a really good and really sustainable and also really pleasurable transport system, so that flying, you know, isn't something people would desire, but that would require a different pricing system, you know, a much better rail system. So I think that it can be done. And I think sometimes a personal kind of veto on certain behavior that you know to be unsustainable in the future is a way of sort of making yourself act publicly in a different way. So I now am really keen on public rail transport on a European level, because I've said to myself, I'm not going to fly when in Europe. It's true, if I was to go to, say, Brazil, which is where I, you know, have had political and personal connections, I would have to fly probably. But let's stop flying in Europe and develop a commitment to fighting for a proper rail system. Dave.
Yeah, can I say something very, very briefly? I think that's right. Building a public transport system that we can rely on is absolutely crucial, and that is cheap. That people, because let's face it, people fly in their droves to Greece and to Spanish islands from the UK, because what is it, 60? You know, sometimes you can get it for £60 or £80 return, right? Now, that brings me on to a kind of, I think, a really key point. If the market, and we know that the kind of market freedom has always been a myth, and the idea that, you know, that what capitalist and particularly neoliberal governments do is they roll back the state and let the market take over. Well, we know that's not the case, because we'd have very few European air carriers left after COVID, actually. Certainly all of the main UK-based airlines would have collapsed without government subsidy. So, I mean, that I think that raises a kind of fundamental question. If capitalist economies were working the way that we're always told they work, we wouldn't have any airlines left, right? Now, that sounds like a very easy answer, but actually that means we've got a choice, and we've got a choice about ending subsidies and switching those subsidies elsewhere. But I honestly think that if we took action as individuals, and obviously, and we can do that. Those of us who are privileged enough to be able to afford to fly, we choose different things. But the solution has to be in collective action, which shifts a distorted market away from unsustainable transport towards sustainable transport. I mean, I think that's a really crucial point that we shouldn't forget. We probably wouldn't have very many European airlines left if the government wasn't stepping in. If European governments weren't stepping in, and they're stepping in to sustain economically and environmentally unsustainable industries. Hilary's frozen.
Hilary, she's gone. In the meantime, let's just move on to the next question. Hey, what is your opinion on individual consumption as a partly solution to environmental problems? I do not see any significant effects of individual sacrifice on large-scale environmental problems. David, you're on your own right now.
Yeah, look, one of the purposes of the book is really to try and focus back on the real drivers of climate change, beyond a kind of limited view of consumption. Now, consumption is important, and especially if you're sitting in Europe, we're driving huge markets, particularly the drive for cheap products in the Far East and so on. I'm not saying that the consumption is not important in that respect, but it's all that we ever kind of seem to do. And I tell the story about watching, which is a great film, The Inconvenient Truth, a film which was a kind of light bulb moment for a lot of people. But if you ever see that film again, and I know there was a second version which I never saw, but if you ever watch that film again, there's a very telling moment at the end where when the credits roll and they go through, well, you have to use, and of course we do. We have to fill our kettle up with less water. We have to use light bulbs which are more energy efficient, and we have to do all of these things, and we have to fly less and all of these things. But at some point in those rolling credits in that film, and I only realized this when I watched the film again when I was writing the book, it says, and if you're religious, then pray. And to me, that kind of sums, it does sum up the kind of individualizing. That's the end point, right? I'm not saying that's what controlling consumption ends up as, but that's the end point of what happens when you individualize consumption. So to me, controlling things as an individual is not a message of hope. It's a message of desperation. And I think we have to be much more hopeful. And that means we need to find collective solutions to what are essentially, as I've argued, collective problems, and one of the things that we need to pick through that Matthew's review in Brave New Europe of the book makes the point very explicit, that this is partly about class power, and I don't mean this in a very kind of rudimentary or didactic sense, but there are elites of people who are kept in power through the way they can invest in corporations anonymously, which allows them simply to retain their status. So it actually is very convenient in that kind of class analysis to say, well, the mass has to change what they're doing, actually. And so the book really tries to say, okay, we are all responsible, right? And I'm not kind of taking the responsibility away from ordinary people, right? But the driver, the machinery of this system that we need to throw a spanner right into is not the mechanics of consumption. It's the mechanics of investment and production.
Hilary, we lost you for a couple of minutes. Did you? Are you there? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, my internet collapsed. I had to leave and then rejoin.
Okay, let me just give you the question then, because you missed out. I'll do quickly. What is your opinion on individual consumption as a partial solution to environmental problems? And I do not see any significant effects of individual sacrifice on large-scale environmental problems.
No, I mean, I agree, and I agree broadly with Dave. I think I'd add maybe that individual sort of actions done in a way that's seen collectively can be consciousness raising. I mean, I think that a lot of the younger generation, I think about my own, you know, like nieces and so on, they became involved in politics often through becoming aware of climate change and climate crisis and the failure of governments and the failure of companies, or the culpability of companies. And so they kind of simply took personal action. But, you know, in a way that personal action wasn't the limit of their action. It was just like their beginning. It's a bit like, you know, in the women's movement that I was part of. I mean, people would begin by personal actions, like refusing to do the washing up, or, you know, refusing to be complicit in the sort of reproduction of male oppression, or, you know, refusing to wear a bra, I mean, was the famous one. You know, so it can begin with those individual actions, and then you find it's talked about, there's public debate, so you already then identify with this movement as a movement. So I think if personal action is seen as a kind of entry point to public action, then we should welcome it and encourage it. So I mean, I think awareness. It's when it's a limit. It's when people think, oh gosh, I'm recycling my rubbish, and I'm doing other various good things, you know, buying light bulbs, everlasting light bulbs, so I'm saving the planet. Well, no, you're not, but you're at least aware that there's a problem. So let's think how, you know, that kind of behavior could be spread. What would be needed to properly control waste so there's zero waste? Or what would be necessary to change production so that actually all light bulbs were long lasting, and built-in obsolescence was no longer the case. So I think there's a relationship between change at the individual level and change publicly and politically, but there has to be the latter.
All right, I'll move on to the next question then. Kill the corporation, but how? Unions are not enough. Capital will simply go elsewhere and leave the workers alone. The companies work within the system of economy, and this system, like any complex social system, reproduces its output. How should the system be changed?
So this is a difficult question. Can I go, Hilary, because I think it kind of leads from your last point. I mean, it's absolutely right. We're not, you know, I don't want to trivialize the kind of the task that's required. I mean, you know, we're talking about deconstructing the system of power that on which the world economy and all of the social relationships throughout, you know, most economies rely on. You know, it's not something. Yeah, it's easy for me to say as an academic, kill the corporation, right? But I think, I mean, one of the things I want to do is shift the debate in terms of what we were talking about a minute ago. So our response to the crisis and our response actually to the environmental crisis is to shore up the autonomy of corporations. I would argue it's a false autonomy, but never mind, that's a different kind of discussion. And so that, and what that means is that the autonomy of corporations must be upheld as the solution, right? So the solution to the climate crisis in the Paris Agreement was the system of climate credits was embedded. Corporations were allowed to trade climate credits and so on, right? the solution to the reduction of plastics is to make sure that corporations are nudged or encouraged not to produce plastics. Now, what we have actually is a system that we never really think about, a system that regulates the threats to our environment at the end point of the cycle, not at the start point, right? So I think once we start to rethink about regulation, and the best example of that I use in the book is that both the president of Bolivia and the president of Ecuador, Correa and Morales, 15 years ago, were talking about and proposing that they would keep the oil in the ground and protect the Amazon if they got compensation from Western governments. That seemed to me to be a very good example of regulating the start point, right? And actually what that does something very profound in terms of thinking about the corporation. It takes the corporation out of the picture, right? And it begins to think, okay, well, if we need particular products to be made, they need that are made for need rather than for profit, then we can think through that much more strategically. So look, the questioner is right. That's not going to happen overnight, and that can't necessarily happen in one country, but there needs to be a movement which completely turns that system and that principle of regulation on its head. That's one thing, and that would, in a de facto sense, undercut the power of corporations. In a legal sense, I think trade unions should be arguing for the withdrawal of limited liability, the principle of limited liability, which enables investors to invest and never pay the full costs of the consequences of their investment. Now, I'm not going to get into that, we don't have enough time. But the basic privileges that investors and directors rely on, I think trade unions have to start campaigning on those. And another project I'm involved in with the Institute of Employment Rights in the UK is to develop a way of thinking about how the trade unions challenge corporate personhood in all its different ways. So that's another mountain to climb. I'm not arguing it's not. And the third thing I'd say is there are economies, sometimes very, very brief historical moments, where the corporate economy has been turned on its head. Argentina is an example I've written a little bit about actually in Red Pepper, but Red Pepper has covered quite a lot the sin patron movement, where factories collapsed in the economic crisis in the early 2000s, and workers then took over their own factories and kept those factories going. There are parts of Europe, there are parts of Germany I don't know very much about, but they rely on a cooperative economy much more, or on a solidarity economy a lot more than in other parts. I think the most developed solidarity economy probably that I've seen is in Catalonia, where you have whole towns and whole areas that rely on energy cooperatives, food cooperatives. There are some parts of Catalonia where the entire food supply chain is controlled by cooperatives. So we do have models where these systems actually work better and more efficiently and more effectively for people than corporations. So two things in summary: it's a huge task that would take a huge struggle. But the second point, it's easier than we think, because we do have a great deal of examples and possibilities that are already out there.
Hilary?
Okay, so I'll just add, I mean, I agree very much with what Dave said, but I'd also just, be a little bit challenging to what you say. Who's the questioner? I can't see, but whoever it is, I respect your point. But I'd say that the idea that, clearly trade unionists on their own are not enough, and certainly not all trade unionists have power, but some do. And I'd say, I mean, this is more a hypothesis, but I'm not sure that, capital is, multinational capital particularly, is footloose. It can move, of course, and it often does when profits can be got elsewhere, but it has to invest somewhere, it has to produce somewhere. And if in manufacturing industry, innovation is key to its profits, it depends on its workforce. Now, a kind of there's no such thing as unskilled, but the kind of shop floor workforce is more, as it were, dispensable than the design draftsperson research department. But even the teams of skilled engineers are crucial in certain companies like Rolls-Royce, for example, or British Aerospace, and I think they won't move necessarily so easily. They actually do depend on those skilled, design and research capacities. So that's one thing. And then secondly, I mean, one's got to recognize that in a way the environmental movement is helping to produce an international trade union movement. For example, there's already an international trade union organization around energy, around alternative energy, involving some of the most important trade unions in different countries. And so there's a sense in which capital has got nowhere to move, particularly capital involved in kind of fairly high level manufacturing production. So I think that we shouldn't, in our analysis of the power of the corporation, we shouldn't completely diminish the power of the movements. Not the trade union movement on its own, but the trade union movement now closely allied with the environmental movement. And that's the new development that I think COVID has opened up, that post-COVID, the trade union movement facing massive redundancies, is just doesn't know what to do. And so it's open to new ideas. And so the ideas coming from the environmental movement around conversion to renewables and so on is crucial. So let's kind of recognize our agency where we have it.
All right, I'll just move on to the next question. Whoops, sorry. I agree that the corporation is the actor most obviously driven by the profit maximization principle at the expense of environment and society. But I think that the idea of profit maximization is much deeper ingrained in all spheres of society, business, public policy, universities, even our private lives. So getting rid of the corporation is a necessary step towards a just and sustainable society, but not sufficient. Do you think that profit is generally incompatible with sustainability and needs to be abolished, or are more moderate approaches to profit conceivable?
Well, let's not run before we can crawl, as they say. I mean, look, obviously I completely agree with the question, but I think that we kind of, and there is a danger of reifying or kind of essentializing the corporation, because it is the most visible kind of representation, personification of profit in our lives. So I think that certainly is a danger, but it also is the place where wealth is stored, reproduced, and kept for all kinds of purposes. It's where wealth ends up. So if we manage to have a world without corporations, I have to say, well, it'd be very difficult to see where those profits would go. There presumably would be other forms of storing capital, of investing capital, but we would have to think that unless there's a kind of corporate model that would keep that wealth safe, then it becomes much easier to collectivize and to deal with that the problem of profit. Yeah, and I think you're right. If you get rid of corporations, though, it may well be difficult to do things on a scale that are not, that are antisocial or are socially destructive. The Lucas plant workers that Hilary was talking about earlier made the distinction between the socially useful and the socially destructive uses of their work and their expertise. And I think it would be much more difficult to organize socially destructive projects without corporations. And so, yeah, I think we have to get rid of a system based on profit, because I believe that the only way that we can survive is by being more collaborative, and by showing more solidarity and by being more cooperative. But yeah, maybe whoever asked that question should kind of explore that, because I think that does get to the heart of the problem. Yeah.
Hilary.
Okay, just a comment to complement what Dave says, with whom I agree. I seem to agree all the time, but anyway, I do in this context. So I think maybe one's got to just think a bit more about what profit is. I mean, profit is the privately appropriated wealth that's created by workers. Now, increasingly, as new technology, particularly automation, is being introduced, that creativity is taking the form of surplus labor time, which is being appropriated by capital, by corporations, as profit. Now, if there wasn't profit, that surplus labor time would be redistributed, or could be redistributed, so that we had a shorter working week, and we were basically liberated from much of the kind of drudgery that so many people have to go through. So actually, getting rid of private profit, or the private accumulation of the creativity of workers, is something we should definitely be aspiring to, because that would liberate a whole lot of possibilities for emancipation, for a shorter working week, for more socially useful production, for more care, for more humanly useful forms of labour. Useful labour, not useless toil, as William Morris put it. So I think that, I mean, it needs a long-term strategy, but the goal should be the elimination of private profit, and the redistribution and sharing of the products of human labour.
All right, the next question I'll answer. It's, could you repeat the name of David Whyte's book? I cannot find it on the timeline. This is the book. It is called Ecocide. The publisher is Manchester University Press. I think if you just go David Whyte book in search machine, you'll find it. So let's move on to the next question. Concerning the potential of trade unions and workers, will they be able to change the profit-first principle of corporations? How could an alternative corporation then look like? What principles would it follow? Who wants to field that?
I think Hilary will has probably got more to say on this than me. But look, I think the key issue is about rather than being kind of thinking about the answer to this question is not just to be posed in the negative. It has to be posed in the positive. So by dismantling the model we have, we need to think about this as a kind of releasing of potential. So I'm not, the argument is not that we don't need organizations. And look, there are big questions that the book doesn't answer. I'm going to hold my hands up. But how do you run an energy infrastructure on a national level without having some kind of form of hierarchical organization, let's say? And I happen to think that we do need some element of a planned economy, but it has to be as democratized as possible. And the book argues for a democratization of those organizations, not just switching back into a kind of a process of nationalization. So there has to be a democratization of the corporation. And by nationalization, I mean the model that was in Britain post 1945. And I happen to think that one of the failures of the left was that when the new right came along in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and said, well, you've got these public behemoth organizations which are inefficient and they don't serve people's needs. So we have to introduce new management structures, new ownership structures, and so on. The left was kind of paralyzed because it didn't have a critique of the old model of the kind of monolithic public corporation, which it had to have, because it's quite clear that they were very hierarchical. They didn't necessarily respond to what people needed, I guess in very similar ways as as you could see in the kind of model of state capitalism in the former Soviet and the former East Germany and so on. So there needs to be a model where we rethink how we organize work and production and the things that we do. But I do accept that there has to be some element of central planning, but it has to be as democratized as possible. The second thing I want to say is that I mentioned the Argentinian Workers Without Bosses movements and the way they organized the factories. And what was really crucial about that, I mean, it wasn't on a huge scale, it was about 120 factories that organized in that way in Argentina in 2000, 2001. But what most of them did was they made sure that they had people who were in different roles, who had different expertises, training other people to do the roles that they wanted to be involved in. So you never just had people who were just cleaners, right? And the place I studied in detail was a healthcare factory, and the receptionist was being put through medical school because they pooled the wages to allow people to develop their skills in different ways that really enhanced the capacity of those organizations. So for me, if we pose it in kind of positive terms, we need to rethink the way that we structure organizations, both in terms of the kind of their democratic decision making, but also the way they release the potential of people who work in those organizations.
Hilary, just
okay, I don't have much to add, but just to say, I mean, that it's possible to have, if we rethink profit and we eliminate private profit and think about the redistribution of the creativity, the product of labor, then we could imagine, I mean, a corporation in a way, in one sense, organizationally, is a coordination of different productive units. But in the case of a corporation, it's for the purpose of private profit. But you could have the coordination of different productive or economic units for the purpose of, for example, fair trade. I mean, so there are corporations like Divine Chocolate, for example, which is actually a corporation, but it's for use values, for social purposes. So it combines cocoa growing cooperatives in Ghana with a sort of ethical chocolate producing company in Germany, and then all kinds of cooperative and other kind of outlets in the UK. And it's coordinated and organized by a board that is not just not for profit, it's for socially useful fair trade. And even you could take a cooperative kind of corporation organization like Mondragon in the
Basque Country.
Basque Country, yeah. I was going to say northern Spain, but the Basque Country. And that's a coordinated organization of cooperatives with a financial center, bank, a school, a research center. But it's almost like a sort of a cooperative equivalent of Benetton. You know, it's a coordinated set of units, but to promote and to reproduce cooperative production. So in a way, there's nothing sacred about the corporation. It's a particular form, but it's the purpose that's what's important. And if we're going to kill the corporation, it's about killing private profit, not about killing the idea of some kind of coordinated unit. That's probably opening a longer discussion, but just a thought.
All right, then let's move on to the next question. I'd like to get through them all, and there are a few more. Hilary placed a lot of emphasis on the importance of workers in bringing change. How do we win hearts and minds to convince people that something needs to change when we exist in a system that keeps us all comfortable? Unlike previous social movements, i.e. civil rights, votes for women, the lower classes are kept comfortable in the current system. I don't quite know about this being comfortable. I don't know where you're living. Anyway, I'll give David or Hilary.
Well, I could make an initial response. I mean, I think, as Matthew hinted, I mean, a large number of people are not comfortable. And I think that the kind of movements that we've been seeing in the last maybe 10 years, whether it's been the movement of indignados in Spain, or the movement for Jeremy Corbyn, or the movement for Bernie Sanders, or now the environmental movement, or the movement against zero-hour contracts. Those movements are driven by people who are facing, you know, precarious work, if any work, by people who are facing high rents, you know, finding it impossible to live in cities where they want to live, like London or Barcelona or wherever it is. And those people are like facing material hardship, and that is driving them, but it's driving them to look for a different system rather than just to look for an immediate solution. I mean, often these organizations they combine a material struggle, like, you know, the struggle against McDonald's or Wetherspoons or other organizations, other companies, other corporations that are, you know, basically using labor as a complete kind of, you know, as just figures, you know, not people, but instead labor that they can hire and fire at will in order to make profits. And so people are getting organized to fight that and have won gains, but at the same time they're often part of movements for wider change. So I think that you know, people aren't comfortable, and clearly now under COVID, it's not just the threat of disease, but also, you know, the threat of unemployment. So that we're entering a period of deep insecurity at many levels. And I think this is making people open to thinking about change, because it's a necessity. I mean, the way that different governments have handled COVID has just been so criminal at times, so kind of outrageous. People are everywhere thinking, what on earth can we do? And they begin by doing things in their own neighborhood, and that can give them a sense of capacity that then can be part of a wider movement. So I think we've got to be thinking, what kind of political organization can make the most of this, can really help to bring people together, to help people gain a sense of strength and also an understanding of the situation they face. So I don't think it's easy. I don't think there's a simple kind of answer. You know, there's not a party that we can suddenly pull out of our back pockets. But we've got to think, how do we bring all this together? But Dave might have the answer.
Well, I mean, I completely agree. I was just going to say something else about the first part of the question, which is, you know, how do we shift the kind of mindset in trade unions? I'm not sure actually we have to. I think the problem is partly institutional. And there was a report published by an organisation called Platform in association with Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace in Scotland, which was based on interviews with oil workers in Scotland. And I think there's a really interesting story there. But the report, one of the findings in the report was that they found that over 80% of workers would want to retrain to be in another industry, and more than half of them would want to retrain to be in renewable energy. You know, and that tells me a lot about, you know, where that group of workers is at. They're not necessarily comfortable with the, and I'm not being patronizing, I'm not putting the blame on those workers. They've never been given a choice over the kind of jobs that they do. And that's the other part of the story. Actually, today, the Scottish government announced a new Scottish investment bank, which is supposed to, I think it's bringing together several million contribution every year to try and develop major public industrial to support industrial strategy in Scotland, and there isn't really an industrial strategy there. Now, we import most of the wind turbines into the UK from Germany, and I'm not criticising that. I realise my audience here, but at the same time, that would have been a key obvious transition of which we're talking about. The oil and gas industry in Scotland, the huge fabrication yards in the kind of Cromarty Firth in Dundee and north of Aberdeen could have been used, that capacity could have been used to develop that technology, but it would have taken a huge investment. There was one, I can't remember his name, there was one company, one entrepreneur who did that and actually built this is anecdotal, but built the wind turbines that sat across from Donald Trump's golf course. I don't know if the audience know that, but Donald Trump owns 2 golf courses in Scotland. And one of the things that almost forced him out of Scotland was the location of these wind turbines. And I remember I was interviewing this guy for an article I was writing, and the guy who'd done it was complaining about the lack of investment in that technology. And so they pretty much left it up to rogue entrepreneurs. And that's one of the reasons we don't have a wind turbine industry in Scotland or indeed in Britain. But if you ask oil workers what they would want, it's very clear. We've seen that this week in that report. They would rather work in that industry. So, I think the other part of the question, if that's what's under the surface of the question, is correct. The trade unions are not doing enough to push a just transition in that sense, and certainly not doing enough to make sure that we have got the industrial capacity to do that. But I think workers are open to using their skills in that way.
All right, let's keep going. Wouldn't it have a much bigger effect to define rules for industries than to regulate the consume of individuals? In my opinion, companies rule how we consume, so we have to set consequent rules for big capital. You're on your own right now, David, so Hilary's back. Why don't you stop then?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this is the crux of it that I was talking about when I was saying, well, you know, if we think about regulation as a process, that we try and deal with the end point, right? But that's a different kind of question. We don't regulate, and if I understood the question rightly, we don't regulate what can be invested in. So there's absolutely no regulation on how much can be made from the production of carbons. For example, there may be carbon taxes, there may be kind of limits placed on emissions in certain industries and so on. But we don't have a system where the production of devastatingly harmful markets is disincentivized. We basically have a financial system where anything can be financed. Almost virtually anything can be financed. And I mean, it's coming to the point that I don't have to mention the name Wirecard right now in Germany for people to know how far the financial sector has gone in terms of almost having the ability to commit frauds inbuilt into the system. And so I think you know, part of what we're talking about is you know, we're not going to rid ourselves of financial investment companies overnight. We're simply not. But we need to be looking at ways in which we regulate investments and the purpose of investments. That's probably quite a vague answer to the question. And we've lost our chair.
Well, I'll say I agree with Dave, and I can't add very much. But I think that we got to recognise the difficulties of regulation. I mean, if it was easy, if it was possible even to regulate corporations, then I'd agree with you. I mean, we've got to take some other structural action rather than just appeals to consumers. But we've got to recognise the power of corporations and the way in which they can avoid and evade regulations. I mean, we should definitely, you know, regulations are important and should be supported. But I think at the same time, we've got to basically also support the emergence of an alternative economy. I mean, I haven't thought this through, but I don't think that an alternative can come simply through the solidarity and social and green economy. But it's a significant factor that has been escalated under COVID. So, you know, people will be aware in their own localities the way in which the failure of the supermarkets to actually organize deliveries and even to have food on their shelves, the whole sort of failure of the just-in-time sort of system has meant that all kinds of new local, quite sort of green food companies, a whole sort of new food chain is emerging, and an awareness of the limits of the traditional corporate food chain. So I think that, I don't know if Dave would agree, but I think that support for that alternative economy, so that people actually, you know, are alternative consumption options, because people are becoming aware of the danger of climate change, not the danger, the threat, the reality of climate change. I mean, it's just in their face, and people are becoming aware of, you know, the source of pandemics in our industrialized food system. So in a way, we need an alternative economy that can respond to that awareness and can begin to gain some weight within our kind of cities and within our daily economies. So I think that's another dimension. It's not an alternative to regulation, but I think it's an important.
I mean, can I just add something very quickly? I know we need to get through the questions, or do you want to go to the next question, Matthew?
No, go ahead, please.
Just, I mean, look, one of the things that we have never managed, which astounds me, is to have a fully integrated fully internationalized trade union movement, and that's astounding, given that we know that whether we're talking about supply chains or complex chain ownerships, or even just the kind of supply and demand of products, that we are all kind of interconnected, and the way that we can take action against, the only way that we can kind of take action in a lot of those kind of consumer supply chains is by having some kind of international solidarity. And there are some good examples of this. That I've worked with a union in Australia called the National Union of Workers, who have tried to organize workers into every stage of the food supply chain in Australia, from the farm to the supermarket. And the only way in which they could fully do that and unionize that chain was by setting up offices in Vietnam and in China, where a lot of the workers were coming from. And to do that, they had to make very, very strong links with the community, the Vietnamese community, and the parts of the Chinese community working in the food industry in Australia. So they had to have strong community links, which they then built internationally, and then they were able to make some kind of to slow down the food production chain in ways actually that did also make it more environmentally kind of sustainable. So I think there's a thing we've not really talked about tonight, which is that we know that capital and the corporate model I've been talking about is international, but we've never managed to internationalize the workers' movement in a way that gives that counter strength and counterbalance, or indeed internationalize our community response.
All right, I'm going to stop with the questions because I promised it'd be an hour and a half. We're now at an hour, 45 minutes. Hilary, why don't you start with closing remarks, and then David, you'll follow. All right? I'm sorry about the questions we didn't deal with tonight. I don't know, it was just such an interesting conversation. There's been the other days we've had 2 or 3 questions, that was all. All right, Hilary. Okay,
no, well, I think firstly, the fact that there are questions unanswered and it's been such a good discussion means that I'm afraid Brave New Europe have to carry on this discussion. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think that what's come out from the discussion is everybody seems to be agreed that the question is one of agency. Nobody's really challenged Dave's basic argument. And so that, in a way, that needs further development, but it can only be developed through experiment, through practice. So we need to be, I think there needs to be more reflection on what's actually happening, because a lot's happening that's kind of beneath the public radar. I mean, the newspapers, the official journals are so, I mean, there's no real interest in any of this beneath the radar stuff. I mean, a little bit in what local government is doing. For example, you know, in the context of the failure of the test and trace system in Britain, some local authorities are just saying, you know, I was going to say fuck you, but you know, maybe that's I shouldn't say that, but they're just saying to the government, you know, you're completely hopeless. We can't rely on you, so we're going to do our own test and trace system. So sometimes something like that will get publicity, but on the whole, none of this, you know, like the ventilator question, the role of workers, you know, I tried to get it into The Guardian, which I sometimes write for, but they wrote back saying, you know, there's too much detail on the role of unions. And I just thought, well, that was the point. You know, the point was to say that actually it involved the workers to an unusual degree, but there isn't interest in that. The idea of workers and what workers are doing or what communities are doing is not of interest. So I think a group like ours has got to pay attention and publicize this emerging actor. You know, I remember the war when people protested against the war in Iraq. You know, there was a great celebration of the role of the public as an actor. You know, almost equivalent to the UN or the US. And I think in a way there is a very fragmented agent emerging around climate change, and we've got to publicize it and give it real sort of legitimacy and self-confidence. So I think I'll end there and hand over to Dave, whose book, remember, you must buy and give to other people.
Yeah, it's more important to build the movement than buy the book, though. I think that's the message we need to leave people with. But look, I just want to say a couple of things. I'm gonna be really self-indulgent here and tell you what my favourite bit of the book is. My favourite bit of the book is a bit in the index. I don't know if you can see it, but I'm not sure you can see it. I'm going to read it out. It's the index entry for capitalism, and it says, capitalism, devouring nature, 75 to 76, and then capitalism eating itself, 114 to 116. That's the way it goes. Capitalism devouring nature, capitalism eating itself. Now, I'm kind of joking, I'm being flippant, but I think that has to give us hope, because capitalism is eating itself. And the one thing that the COVID period has shown us, I know I've said a little bit about this, is that the corporation itself has been kept on life support. Actually, let's be more precise about that. COVID has revealed the extent to which corporations need to be kept on life support by governments using our money, using our value. Hilary very clearly described. The value that we produce is used to keep corporations on life support. Capitalism is eating itself, and that's why the furlough scheme in the UK was called the wage subsidy scheme, went straight into the human resource departments of corporations. It's why all of the loans went straight to propping up all of the sectors that were vulnerable, including all of our key infrastructural sectors. So capitalism is eating itself. If we can build a movement, we are the ones that have to take advantage of that. We have to show where the alternatives are and the workable alternatives are that are going to allow us to survive, because it's not going to come from those who invest in the companies that are being kept on life support. So it's devouring nature, but capitalism is also eating itself.
So I'd like to thank you, both of you, very, very much for participating in what was really a very, very interesting discussion. A question for our public, because I'm very pleased to see that there's so much interest for this. Actually, we were thinking of the next webinar being with Gary Young about Black Lives Matter and Europe. On the other hand, after seeing how interested people were, the other possibility would be getting Yorgos Kallis and Jason Hickel, who have both just published books about degrowth, and getting both of them to have a similar discussion. Actually, we're very democratic about this. I'll give you our email address. It's info@braveneweurope, in one word, .com. You can contact us and say what it is you would like us to do next for the next webinar, which would be in November. I'll do that quickly in German. I don't know if Lea got all that. Sie haben die Möglichkeit mitzubestimmen, was die nächste Veranstaltung ist. Wir haben daran gedacht, an Gary Young und Black Lives Matter in Europa. Oder wir könnten dieses Thema fortsetzen, indem wir Yorgos Kallis und Jason Hickel, die 2 verschiedenen Bücher, also Yorgos mit anderen Autoren, die haben beide Bücher über Degrowth gerade herausgebracht und wir könnten die auch zusammenbringen in eine Veranstaltung. Schreiben uns ganz kurz, was Sie gern hören möchten. Das wäre info@braveneweurope in einem Wort .com. All right. Once again, thank you very, very much. I know it's grown a bit late. And I'd like to also add my opinion. I think Ecocide is a book really worth reading because this is the discussion we have to really push at the moment, because what we're seeing is all the governments in Europe are just propping up the old corporate capitalist profit-oriented system, and we're even seeing companies that are being saved with taxpayers' money, literally being saved, like the airlines. The first thing, first they did, some of them had paid dividends, and then they're using the money to fire their employees. And this is not, I really don't think, is what we all imagined, as what should be done with funds. And there's a lot of money going to airlines, which could just as well be invested in rail or other public transport. Because I think we ought to be honest, even the airlines, I think are starting to realize they are zombie corporations. And so why are, this was the thing the neoliberals always said, why are we, supporting the zombie companies? But this is exactly what the neoliberal governments are now doing. So read the book, and I think this is where the discussion is going to have to go, is what do we want? Because what we want is much better than just saying what the government's doing is shite. That's not an answer. It's very easy criticism. And I think I'll just leave it at that point. Thank you very much, everyone, also the audience. I apologize that we didn't get through all the questions, and hope to see you in November. Bye.
Thank you.